or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So my name is Wagner Silveira, and I'm going to be a presentation about API management, talk about some tips and tricks with advanced policies. A little bit about me. I'm the principal integration architect at Tita. I'm Microsoft Azure MVP for the fourth year in sequence. We all received our renewals yesterday, so it's probably saw lots of people talking about how humble they are in be part of that community. I'm one of them. I'm also MCSE Cloud Platform and organizing of some user groups here on the Asia Pacific. I'm organizing of the Auckland Connected System user group. There is a group focused on integration and Azure here in Auckland, New Zealand, and also Integration Down Under. There is a series of webcasts run it from a mix of Australian and New Zealand time zones, right? If you want to get in touch with me, I always on Twitter on WSilveiraNZ, or you can get touch through the email wagner.silveira@noteyourself.tech. And I have a blog that is reasonably actual, so I keep writing on that, called https noteyourself.tech. The agenda for today, I'm going to do like a quick API management introduction for people that might not be used to the technology yet. I'm going to explain a little bit what is policies, so why policies are something that is quite interesting and makes the API management an interesting tool. How those policies are executed so we can take the best out of them. Talk a little bit about policy expressions that takes those policies to the next level, allow you to be quite dynamic, and show some tips, tricks, and samples. After that, I'll just wrap up with a little bit of a takeaway. So if I could define API management in one slide, API management came to help two classes of developers that need to interact, right? You have API publishers, people that is like writing APIs, and you have API application developers, people that needs probably to consume those APIs. On one side, the API publishers are writing those APIs on a whole set of different technologies. They can be using Kubernetes, they can be using Service Fabric, Logic Apps, Function. They can be writing old code still on WCF. They can be using Java or a whole lot of different things. On the other side, application developers, they are really interested in using those APIs to write first or third party applications, right? Either they part of the same team inside of a company and they need to consume those APIs to create a product for other people, or they wanted to get a mashup of APIs from different companies and creating those fantastic applications, right? Part of that audience is coming from business solutions, so they used to connecting things from different places to creating those applications together. So API management come to kind of close that gap between those two. They have basically three main functions. On one side, they're going to be allow the API publishers to, through Azure Portal and today through the VS Code, publish those APIs in a centralized location with a more uniform representation of those APIs so people can easily discover and consume that, and also allow those API publishers to deal with things like versioning, authentication and authorization, caching, and a whole lot of things like that. On the other side, it's going to help the application developers to discover and consume the APIs that those API publishers put it together, right? In a easy way to use that without you having to sit besides the app developer and teach them to use those APIs. So that's what the developer portal from the API management gives to you. And it's all good for us to have something published on one side and consumed on the other one, but there is always the time where those applications is actually deployed and you need something to mediate that connection, right? So this is what the gateway does. The gateway is the actual runtime of the API management that gets all that configuration that you do on publish and allow the developers, after they understood the APIs and put it inside their applications, when they do a request to any one of those APIs, to say, yes, you have the right to use that API because you have the right keys for that. You didn't blow up your quota yet, so you can continue consuming. And behind the scenes, I'll change the way that API is represented in the front end to the way that the applications are actually expecting to receive that. So in a nutshell, in about 2 minutes or so, this is what API management is in 3 blocks, right? Part of that mediation is based on a set of configurations that you do inside API management. And those configurations are called policies. So what are those policies? Basically, they are a way to either mutate the request or the response, to mutate that context, or to change the API behavior. By default, that API is, or one of the operations is behaving in a way, but depending on external factors, you can change that. Sometimes the request for that API needs to be modern, like a JSON, but behind the scenes, that API still consumes legacy code like WCF and XML. So doing that transformation or changing those contexts is what the policies are there for, among other things. So what the way that these policies do is encapsulating a set of common API management functions like access control, allowing you to protect your API without having to write code on the back end, protecting the API against abuse, for example, only allowing people to call that X number of times every 60 seconds or 90 seconds or something like that, doing those transformations that we talk about, creating caching, so you don't have to hit the backend all the time. And the way those policies work is chained together into a pipeline. So actually what you do is you get snippets of policies that you put together and create the policy that is specific for your API or specific for your operation. It's applied at a variety of levels, right? So what we have on policies, and we're going to be discussing that in a minute, is the policies can be written at various levels inside the hierarchy of API management. You can write it at a global level, you can write it at an API level, at the operation level, you can write it at what a special middle layer that is called product, and you're going to understand that in a minute. And the other thing that we have is that those are the policies can be writing when the request is coming from the front end before it hits the back end, or after you receive the backend response before you send it back to the requester, right? So it can be set on the inbound direction or the outbound direction. And it also can be triggered when you have an error. So if some kind of error happens either on the inbound direction or on the outbound direction, you can have specific triggers to deal with that error and either put a different type of message there or put more information if you want. So how those policies are executed? we talked about those scopes, so let's understand a little bit more what they are. So first, you have a global scope. That means that whole API management instance, right? When you creating when you deploy API management into Azure, we call that an API management instance. And you can create a global scope, or because of that, you can create policies that applies to every single API, every single product, and every single operation inside that API instance. Then after that, we have another level that's called product. The product from API management point of view is a group of API together that are either sell or delivered to clients as a bundle. If you have access to a product, you have access to all the APIs inside that product, right? So that is really good if you either selling APIs to third parties, because you can create different other offers. You can say my basic offers has 5 APIs from my group, and you can use that 1,000 calls per month, where my premium offer has my 10 APIs, all the APIs that I have available, and you can use that 5,000 times a month, or you don't have limits on that. And the way that you decide for the same API, what is the extra functionality that you're going to give to different clients is via those products. Then, as I said before, you have the API layer, right? So you can create a policy that is applied to all the operations of an API. And of course, you have each one of the operations. So when you're talking about operations here, we're talking about either a get, a post, a put, or a delete inside each one of the paths in your API. To give an example, at the global layer, you could have, for example, your logging policy. You could define how you're going to be doing the log, or you could have your course policy, how you do the cross domains scripting. At the product level, as we discussed before, you could put stuff like your rate and your quota. So how many times you can hit in a number of seconds, and what is the maximum size that you can have on that duration. You can have, for example, JWT validation, so your OAuth validation at an API level. And you can have like caching, URL, or the body transformations at the operation level. Just as an example, right? You can move those things around, but just to give an idea of what kind of policies we could have and where those policies could sit, this is an example. So if you think something like a request that is get to a full API on a bar operation using a key 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, blah, blah, blah. The key is what defines a product. The key is always associated to a product, right? So we identify each product you are because you pass in a key associated to that product. The /full indicates the API at this place, at this stage. So anything after full is going to first hit the API operations, or the API policy, sorry. And /par would be here. But, and probably that is kind of the first tip on all of that. When I first saw that, until I have to actually use it for real, I thought that each one of those policies were kind of applied, as I see in here, in different boxes. So you only see the global, and if you pass the global part, then you can start seeing the product policies, and after you pass the product, then you can see API, and then you could see the operations. In reality, actually, it's not exactly how it works. When you receive that get full bar with key blah, the API management first find out which operation I'm talking about, which API, which product, and which instance of the API management I'm hitting, and it combines all those policies in one big set of policies, and that's what's called the effective policy. Why I'm talking about that is because later on, we're going to have one of the tips that I'm going to give you is, because of all of this, you should be able to actually know which operation, which API, which product you are at any of those levels, and you can use those information to actually change the behavior of the API management execution at that level. Before we talk about tips and tricks, let's talk a little bit about policy expressions. Right? So what is a policy expression? Is a bit of C# snippets using within the policies. So those policies are so powerful that actually is not just a set of configuration that you can put there. In some cases, you can actually run a little bit of C# script inside those policies, and that makes them extremely dynamic. Those policies are going to have read-only access to the request context. So all the information from the request, the body, from where it comes, what is the headers, what is the JWT token that you have associated, all that set of information, you have access in a read-only way. It can use a set of whitelisted .NET types. So you can actually, you don't have access to the full .NET, but you have access to a good chunk of things that allow you to actually write those codes. And with all of that, it allows you to dynamically configure or conditionally execute the policies. So you can have things like choose if I have this particular header, run this bit of the policy, otherwise run that other bit of the policy, because I have access to all of that information and I can dynamically run that. So you can see how powerful all of that is. The other thing that is quite interesting is you can get policy expressions and put that, the actual policy expression, in a bit of the configuration inside API management called name values. As the name says, that is kind of a name valued lookup table where you can store configurations that is accessible API management wise. But for example, if you wanted to create something that is current date time, instead of writing that policy everywhere, you can simply write the policy, the C# snippet for the get date time in a particular time zone, put that against a name value, and simply refer to that instead of having to remember how to write that everywhere. And later on, if you say that now my policy needs that value to be date time -1, then you only have to change it in one place instead of having to change it across all your policies. So as you see, policies are something that is extremely helpful and extremely powerful inside API management, and changes a little bit how the definition of those APIs work, right? And that's what makes API management really, really powerful. What I'm going to do from now is I'm going to show you a number of the samples and give you some tips and tricks that I found during my time with that. Right, so let's talk about some tips, some tricks, and show some samples. My first tip on that area is as we saw before, we have a policy that is related to caching. But first thing that you think about cache is I'm going to be doing a call to the request, and I'm going to be caching that request or that response based on some values, and then I don't have to go back to the API management anymore, right? But you can use cache for much more than just restore results from the backend. So you can use cache for things that can be, for example, hard to compute. Like if I needed to generate a particular type of key to use against a backend, instead of doing that every time that I hit that API or hit that operation, I can actually cache that and let it expire after some time. So when I receive different calls, I don't have to run through all that computation again. We saw just before that you can actually write C# code inside the policies, right? But I don't want it to be running that C# code if I don't have to, because there is more processing that I needed to take out of my request. And you want the request to go back to the backend as fast as possible. Otherwise, you're adding latency. So in this case, you can use cache to store things that would make your processing before you hit the backend, or to store the response from the backend and making sure that you don't have to do the round trip. Okay, so that would be the first tip. Use cache for more than just store results from the backend, and we're going to see an example in a minute. Second tip would be use policy expressions to dynamically create content during runtime. So some of the stuff that maybe you needed to push to the backend system just because you couldn't do that before, if you're not using API management, you can now do on API management and let your backend system running a little bit more vanilla. They only do the stuff that it really needs to do, and some of the things that you needed to do that might be used for some clients but not the others, you can push into the API management. The third one that is quite interesting is you can actually execute other calls than just the backend request, right? So by default, if you're thinking about a proxy between my request and my client and my backend, which is what usually API management is seen from outside, I would say the only thing that I do is I receive a request, I get that request, I push it to the backend, I receive a response on that backend, and I push it back. Maybe I do some transformation, maybe I do some protection code, right, or things like that. But you actually can do a call to another system before you can actually do the call to the backend. And the demo that we're going to show here gets a little bit of those three tricks and put them together on that. So what we're going to do is I have a system where my client has some time of authentication, in my case, just the normal API key, just for demo purpose, but my backend needs to receive an OAuth token. My client cannot give me this OAuth token because he doesn't know how to talk, or he doesn't have the ability to talk to that identity provider. But I can, on the fly, generate that OAuth token, which means that I have to make a call to the identity provider. I can cache that value, so I don't have to run it all the time. And I can verify if I have a valid OAuth token on cache instead of running all that code, right? So let's see how that works. Okay, so what we have here is the API management for those that doesn't know how that looks, right? And on the side, you have access to the APIs. So it's here where you can create a new API. You can see that when creating those APIs, you can connect to a whole lot of different services, or you can create a blank API to connect to a service that you provide. Okay, we're not going to explore that because the focus of the session is actually talked about the policies. But at some stage, if you want, we can have the 101 session on API management itself. So on that one, what I'm going to show you is I have an API called OAuth backend sample. And in here, I have an operation called login, right? And inside that operation, I have my inbound processing area. As I said before, you have the bits where you can do the inbound inject policies on the inbound direction. I have my backend where I go to a backend endpoint, and I have an outbound processing where if I need, I can go and run I can go and run other policies. Okay, so the policies looks like that. And before I actually show you it here, I show another tip. That is, for those using Visual Studio Code or are interested on Visual Studio Code, API management also have an extension, right? So if you search for Azure API management as an extension, what that's going to give you is the ability to have an Azure tab where it shows all the subscriptions that you have associated to your current credentials. Inside each one of those is going to show you if it exists the API management instances associated to that, right? So that API management instance that you saw a minute ago is that W Silveira consumption. And here you can see that we have a set of APIs and I have the global policy. As I said before, you have those name values and you have those products, right? So it's a better representation of that hierarchy. If I open the APIs, they show me the list of APIs that I have. Install that, include that OAuth backend sample. And if I come here, I can see my API level policy or my operations with their own policies. On any of those levels, I can actually click on the policy and it's going to show here with a nice set of code. And you can also have in here IntelliSense, right? So you can find the policies and it's going to create like the basic policy to you. So you should be able to like just complete. So it gives you a lot of guidance on that. Okay. If I make changes to that and I click on save, it's going to ask if I wanted to upload it directly to API management. So now don't do that because you don't tempt in the demo gods. So now what we're doing with this is I have the ability to, on my local machine, just working on Visual Studio Code, make changes on the APIs or on the API management policies, save and have all of that reflected on the instance straight away. Make it a little bit bigger. So that is probably tip 0. if you can, use the Visual Studio Code extension, because it gives you a lot of good stuff. Okay, so back to that example, what we have here is, as we said before, I have a set of inbound policies. I have the call to the backend, and then I have a set of outbound policies and the policies that are executed on the error. Okay, on that example, what I have is, when I don't have, first I try to find on my cache a key called bearer token. If I have, put that on the bearer token variable. Then when I don't find that variable, I'm sending a request to a specific URL, right? And see that thing here with this double quotes or double curly brackets, that is actually a name value. If I come down here and look for name values, I should have OAuth server authorization server. If I double click and edit the name, I'm going to find what is the value for that, right? Funnily enough, it's just a OAuth 2 token endpoint, because I'm trying to get an OAuth token for that. Then what I'm doing is I'm doing a send request to that URL with a method post, with a header called content type with this value, and with this body. And here, what I'm doing with those @, what I actually doing is writing client ID with the client ID that I store on name values, scope with that scope, client secret, and the grant type of client credentials. So as you can see, I'm writing a body on the fly with data that I have on my name values. Then I send in a request to that endpoint, and I put in the response on a variable called access token results, right? Then after that, what I'm doing is I getting the body of that access token into another variable. I getting just the bearer token value into this other variable. I set in a token duration in seconds. Then I putting that in the cache, right? That one shouldn't be here. It's just doing that again was me showing that in the last presentation that I did about that. Then now that I have this on that variable called bearer token, I set in the authorization for my backend with the value of bearer, but that value. Then I call my backend service. So if all of that works, what it actually does is getting that, putting into the backend, putting the authorization against the backend, sending the call to the backend. If it accepts the OAuth token, it comes back with 200. If it doesn't accept the token, then it would come back with 401 with an error. What I'm doing on the outbound, if I receive a condition of 401 or a condition of 403, that means that that token is not valid. There is no reason for me to keep that value. So I go and just remove the cache value. Okay. So with that, you can see how powerful that thing is. How can I test that? I can come here to the OAuth back sample. and I can say a test operation. It's going to create the items here. I just need to find a subscription key. And I'm going to get a subscription key. Is one of the few things that we cannot get directly from here, but I can get a subscription key for the from this. Actually, not going to tempt fate. I'm going to get this one here. So this is another fantastic tip from the API management tool. What I'm doing here is basically I'm sending a post request to this endpoint, which is my API management endpoint with that subscription key as a header and that tracing as another header. If I click on send request, it executes. Takes a little bit to run. Did I click on send? Ah, there we go. And it come back with a 200, which means that it worked, right? But if I wanted to know what happened behind the scenes, I can go and look at the trace. I could do something like get that value. And if I execute that is REST client. Send a request, Control-Alt-R. Then this is also quite powerful. What that does, it shows you everything that is executed inside those policies. So each one of the policies that you created there, it's doing here, right? So if you can find, it executed the cache lookup, and then it tried to find, since it couldn't find the value, not context was set to true, it did the set method, the set header, the set body, then it did the send request for this, received this value back, right? A token type para, blah, blah, blah. Then it set a whole lot of variables until it has just the token. And just to prove that that's the token, just taking a look at the time, still okay. Just to prove that that's the token, if you go to there we go, is a JWT token coming from this place with just very simple values. Right? Then they did all the tests, set the header as authorization bearer, send it to the backend, receive a 200 back, and send the response back to us. So as you can see, the policies can be kind of complex to understand sometimes and kind of complex to debug, but this trace ability allow you to actually see exactly what happens on each one of the other steps. In the future, the API management team is planning to actually create the debugging on the policies, right? And that is going to apply to the full set of policies, as we said before. Okay, so let's go back to the presentation. That was the first demo and seems like it worked. I hope that you guys enjoyed that one. Next tip that I have to you is sometimes you wanted to do things differently on the back end, depending on what type of client, but you don't want it to give the client the ability to put that information there, because they can kind of abuse this, right? But this is kind of a really simple way for you to use the API management policies as a way to say, if you're coming from a group of clients, do something in the middle to let the backend know that it's coming from client A, B, or C. Or if it's coming from that other set of clients, then let it know that it's different. Okay? We're going to be showing that with a really simple demo that is injecting specific headers based on a product. So far, we only explore the policies inside the API. Now we're going to go one level up on that list and apply that to a product for all the operations that is associated to that product. Okay, so if I come back here on API management, what I have is an API called conditional log, right? That API is connected to a logic app. So here you can see that you can connect it, you can use a whole lot of different things with API management. And that logic app is extremely simple. What it does is, when I receive a request, if that request have a header call log enabled, mimic log, right? I just composing here, but that imagine that that is actually a log. Otherwise, do nothing. But don't wait to reply to the endpoint before I do that. To send a response and then log. What we have on this side is I have a set of products, right? And I have a high privilege product and a low privilege product. The high privilege product is like my high-end product, so that one has more access to more stuff, including this log, right? So if you go back to Visual Studio Code and look now not at the APIs, but to the products, oh, refresh. Come on, demo gods. Just refresh at that level here. You guys still there? Okay, seems like my Visual Studio died a little bit. Let's come back to here, to the products. So I'll look at that, the products. I'll look at the policies on that product. And one of the policies that I have is, when the log is enabled, if I using that product, add the header log enabled. Okay. So in this case, what we're gonna do is, if I go to my API and click on the conditional log and do a test, so you can do the same things that we were doing there on the API management Visual Studio extension here on the portal. So I'm going to execute that one, that post. adding a body saying hello world Azure Saturday. And I'm going to be using the high privilege product. So if everything goes fine, when I send this, I'm going to receive back just hello world with 200 OK. And if I go to my Logic app, and look at this, because I have that header, I add a hello world Saturday. Okay. Then I'll do exactly the same one, but I'm going to be calling the low privilege product and send it again. Still should receive a 200, but if I come back and look at the response at 801, I didn't run my compose because the response for that was false. I don't have that header. So you see that the request didn't insert that header. Who inserted the header was the product. So you have a way to deal with that there. Okay. So that was my second tip. You can use products to aggregate stuff that is specific to a certain number of the clients. You go back to the presentation. My last tip for today is the policies are always executed at the operation level. What I mean for that is exactly that idea of having a group of policies that understands the whole context where you are, no matter where you write that policy. So you're going to understand that better with this example here. What I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to be dynamically authorizing certain operations based on the products that it comes, right? We have 10 minutes, so I should be able to show that to you. On this last demo, I have an API called Privileged API, and I have a set of operations. So that GET allows anyone to access the operation. The POST high privilege, it's only allowed for the high privilege. That one is for the low and the high, and that one should be not be accessible for anyone because it's not registered yet. The way that we work, that I work with this is, if I go to my design, if I look at the policies, what I'm doing here is telling what is the product that I'm connected to, then get a special set of a value from name value called privilege API rows, right? Let's take a quick look at that value. This privileged API rows is a set of JSON that says all access operations can be accessed to all products. The low privilege operation can be accessed by the low privilege product and the high privilege product. And the high privilege operation can be accessed by only the high privilege product. So I create a map between the operations that I have available and the products that I have available for that API. With this, now, if I go back to the API, what I can do is I can write a piece of C# code, right? That by default it says don't allow, get what the ID of my product, which is exactly those values, the high privilege, low privilege product, get the name of my operation, then get that privilege API row, break down in tokens, and see if I have either the value all on my list for that operation, or if I have the name of the product. If I have that, return allowed. Then respond. When that variable, operation allowed, that executes that code, says not allowed, return 403, return an error. Otherwise, just continue. Okay? And on that one, what I'm going to do is just going to add here one more thing. I'll put a return response with a 200. Need any other headers? So if all of that work, right, if it's allowed, it's going to return 200 with hello Azure Saturday. Otherwise, it's return a response with a 403. Okay? Then I'll save that. And let's do some tests. I'll test the get all. With the low privileged. I receive 200 is all fine. I'll test the high one with the high privilege product. Sorry, with the low privilege again. And I receive 403. Sorry, you can't. But if I test with the high privileged, I receive 200. And just to finish that one, if I get the unregistered API, doesn't matter what product I call, it returns 403 because that one is not available to user it yet. I have a whole blog post about that particular one, right? And I don't wanted us to focus too much on the functionality of that, but also mainly the ability of what the policies can do for you. So since we're getting close to the end, if you come back here, the takeaways that I would like you to take out of this is the first one, poly expressions, as you can see, is a very powerful tool, right? There is a whole lot of things that you can do with that, and you can actually make the API management your best friend when controlling how your APIs are being working, pushing some of the stuff that you would have to customize or write on your client just for on your backend just for some clients into that place, into API management. So the product, exactly because the product's policy allow you to conditionally inject APIs, inject policies on the API. So now you can say If I come in from a group of clients, I have that extra tests or that differentiation, and I can do that differentiation using policies on that level. And although policies are written at different scopes, they are always rendered first, put together at the operation level. As you see on that one thing that I didn't mention is the whole policy was written at the API level. But at that level, I know what is the product name was and what is the operation name was, right? So that proves that although I have different policies in different places, I still am able to get all the context around a request on all the levels of that policy. And because of that, write the policy always at the highest scope that is possible to avoid having to write the code twice. So on that one, I needed the API policy. I needed the policy to test if the operation was associated to a product. But I wrote at the highest level possible, that was the API, right? So I couldn't write it twice, one for each one of the operations, or twice, one for each one of the products. So I have a set of resources. I'll give you kind of a minute if you wanted to the print screen, or after we finish this, I'll put those 3 links at the at resources. The first one is the root for Microsoft Docs around API and policies. The second one is the link directly to API policy expressions, right? So you can go there and find more information about those policy expressions that we discussed. And the third one is my blog post about that example that we just showed in the last demo with more details there, if you're interested on that. And with that, thank you very much. We have another 3 minutes for questions, but I can stay on during the interval to respond questions on the chat. And if you wanted to get in touch with me, it's just repeating some of my contact information. And that's it. Narayan, do we have any? Do you know if you have any questions, or there was any questions on the chat window? Narayan? If you have two, cool. I just saw my first question here. If we have policies at 2 different levels, what's going to happen is the policy at the lowest level is going to win, because you're going to try to apply that and then try to apply it again. So in the end, the one at the lowest level is going to win. Thanks, Santosh, for the question.
Thank you, Wagner. Can you hear me now?
I can, mate.
Fantastic.
Hopefully that's all gone. Was recorded okay.
Yeah, it's recorded, and I'm still keeping the recording on if someone has a question, so we can cover that up. But
okay.
the session was really, really good, very interesting. Thank you, Wagner, for all these demos and tips and tricks. Azure API management is one of my favorite subjects as well, and I really liked it as well. And I'm sure all the attendee has same feeling as well.
Thank you. All right. Seems like we
where can I find? Sorry,
go ahead.
Where can I find the record? Where can I find the recording?
Okay, so the recording will be available on YouTube. Currently, we are streaming on YouTube, which is PowerPoint 365 Saturday. We will share those links online as well, so you can grab those recordings and re-review those sessions as well. I'm sure it's a lot of things to take on in this short time, so recordings are very useful, and we will definitely share it. Make sure to submit your feedback so we can collect your contact details and we can definitely contact you back. Also, make sure to submit your question if you are not able to ask now and you have the questions maybe later on. We have provided that forms as well. Wagner, do you have anything to say?
No, I just going to put the those resources, those 3 resources that I had. I'll put in on the chat window now.
Fantastic.
Yeah, just try not to paste with the. Okay, I'll be putting that in a minute. It's just a really big fonts for now. Need to go to our friend Notepad++ to clean it up first. There we go. And if and also put my contact details here on the chat window. If anyone needs to get in touch or have other questions, I can also reply to that. I usually on Twitter, and so I just put that one there. Thank you very much, mate.
Thank you, Wagner. So we're going to have 15 minutes break, but if you do have any question, please feel free to put in the chat window.
Yeah,
If
I'm
you
going
are
to stay
watching online, sorry,
I'm going
Wagner?
to stay online for a little bit more. So if anyone has questions during those 15 minutes, then it's fine. After that, it's already almost 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock here in New Zealand. I have to put the kids to bed.
Sure, please do so.
Thank you.
And if you are watching online on YouTube and if you are putting questions there, we are monitoring. So please feel free to post your question either on chat window in Teams or YouTube, or after event, you can still use Q&A form to send your questions, and we will revert back to you in email.
So I have one question, sorry. Quick question. So on YouTube, what channel, what do I need to type to be able to see this session?
Sure.
The recorded
Let me
session?
bring it up on the screen.
Okay, thank you.
I just added to the I just added to the to the meeting chat.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. And you can see on screen as well. So it's a channel called PowerPoint.